Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor, members of University Senior Management, Professor Alastair Blanshard, the Paul Iliadis Chair of Classics and Ancient History, Dr. Paul Iliadis himself, UQ colleagues, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. Welcome everyone to the inaugural Professorial lecture of Professor Alastair Blanshard, the inaugural holder of the Dr. Paul Iliadis Chair in Classics and Ancient History. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Associate Professor Martin Crotty, and I am the head of the School of History, Philosophy, Religion and Classics. And I'd like to begin this evening's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather and meet, and I think we should pay our respects to elders past and present. When we talk of ancient history, we tend of course to think of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but on an occasion such as this, I think it might do us well to remember that Australia has its own ancient history as well. Now, I'll be chairing this evening, but fortunately for you all, I won't be speaking much. I'll be leaving that to Professor Blanshard in the main. But I will just say that as a head of school, I'm delighted to be working in a university where we have leadership that quite rightly values the humanities, where we have alumni and benefactors who are prepared to sponsor and assist in the study of the ancient world, on which you will hear more shortly from the Vice-Chancellor, and where we can attract staff of the calibre of Professor Alastair Blanshard. And amid the flurry of assessment that accompanies the end of every semester, an occasion such as this is both pleasant and important. It provides us with the opportunity to come together as a community of staff, students, alumni, benefactors, honoraries and others, and it gives us the opportunity to celebrate two great virtues: munificence on the part of a great benefactor of the university, and scholarship on the part of an already internationally renowned and still rising scholar of the ancient world. So may I thank you all for coming. I'd also like to particularly thank the professional staff in the School of History, Philosophy, Religion and Classics, staff from Protocol and the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences who have made this evening possible. And please, I must remind you to ensure that your mobile phones are turned off. I'll now hand over to Professor Peter Hoy, UQ's Vice-Chancellor and President, who will acknowledge somewhat more fully the generous gift of Dr. Paul Iliadis before introducing Professor Alastair Blanshard. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, and it's wonderful to see such a sold-out room. I think both Paul and Alastair should be well pleased with that, and I think it actually reflects a much greater affinity for the arts and humanities than people normally think there is. At any rate, let me just start also to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather and meet and pay our respects to elders past and present. It says here that I should acknowledge the presence of the Chancellor. Well, our Chancellor is not quite here yet, and it's because he's been out working hard on behalf of the University interstate, and he was on a plane that should have gotten him here, were it not for Brisbane, late afternoon, and Coronation Drive. So he's stuck somewhere there at the moment. We have lots of members of our senior management group, and of course we have Professor Alastair Blanshard and Dr. Paul Iliadis, and it's wonderful to have you here. UQ colleagues, distinguished guests. I often say that UQ's greatest contribution to society is its 215,000 alumni, and that each alumnus, or alumni, has capacity to enhance the reputation of the university and therefore experience the success and the students that will follow them. Now, I do a lot of these things, and I just saw Dr. Mark Loan in the audience as well, and Mark Loan, of course, gave the E.S. Myers lecture to all our medical students some time ago, and is an unbelievable exponent for how, as a UQ graduate with the right attitude, that you can have both personal and professional success, and that professional success can be spread to the benefit of others. So it's great to see you here, Mark. Nevertheless, we're not here to celebrate Mark. We've got some really great stuff here. This evening we actually celebrate the contributions of two outstanding UQ alumni, two men from different backgrounds and fields of expertise, who share a passion for the classics and ancient Greek history and a desire to help current and future generations understand the links between modern society and those who came before them. Their names, Dr. Paul Eliadis, our wonderful benefactor who has been most generous to us, and Professor Alastair Blanshard, you will both now forever be linked to UQ. Dr. Eliadis is a distinguished clinical hematologist, oncologist, entrepreneur, and patron of the arts. I also know that Paul likes a very good bottle of wine, and as a former director of the Australian Wine Research Institute and wine show judge, I not only like the fact that he likes wine, I adore the fact that he shares it so readily. But it's not only me who benefits from that. His extraordinary generous gifts to his alma mater established the academic chair in classics and ancient history at UQ. An endowed chair is an enduring gift. It is a way of building the capacity of the university, already the only university in this state to offer courses in the history, culture, language, and literature of ancient Greece and Rome, and guaranteeing the classics and ancient history pride of place in the 21st century Queensland. I think that's a very, very important thing to do. I take this opportunity to once again thank you, Paul, for this remarkable gift to UQ and to Queensland. The man who has been appointed as the inaugural chair of classics and ancient history, Professor Alastair Blanshard, may not have taken the Hippocratic oath as Dr. Eliadis may have done. I'm sure you did, Paul. But I'm sure he could tell you about Hippocrates and a great deal else about health and medicine in ancient Greece and the relevance of those topics to the modern world. Alastair enrolled in undergraduate study at UQ in Arts and Law in 1990. As a law student, he demonstrated a talent for mooting. He was voted Best Individual Mooter, was on the winning team in the Queensland Law Society mooting competition, and even represented UQ in the Jessup International Law Moot in Vienna, a competition which is a global competition among 685 law schools globally that UQ again won in 2014 in Washington, D.C. Despite his aptitude for the law, Professor Blanchard's love of the ancient world won out. He completed his Bachelor of Arts with first-class honours in 1994 and an MA at UQ in 1996 before travelling to the University of Cambridge for his doctoral studies on rhetoric, identity and ideology in the Athenian law court. He was awarded his PhD in 1999, jointly winning the Hare Prize for Best Dissertation in the process. Most recently a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney, Dr. Blanshard has taught at the University of Reading and at Merton College, Oxford. He's an internationally recognised leader in the field of classical tradition with research interests including Greek cultural history, Greek rhetoric and law, epigraphy, ancient sexuality, and the role that the classics past plays in the history of ideas. He's the author of 3 books, Hercules, A Heroic Life, Sex, Vice and Love from Antiquity to Modernity, and Classics on Screen, Ancient Greece and Rome on Film. If you've ever been up late at night in Sydney, you may have heard Dr. Blanshard's regular segment on 2GB radio with Michael McLaren, where he discusses contemporary current affairs and finds parallels in antiquity. Here his linguistic talents, knowledge and love of his subject matter are given a full rein as he vividly recounts social and political aspects of the ancient world. By way of example, following sometimes heated discussion in the media about the federal government's proposed increase in fuel excise, Professor Blanshard enthusiastically discussed transport and taxation in the ancient Rome. He seamlessly moved from discussing the communal use of wagons and the sharing of transport in the world to the Go-Get car share service in the Sydney and the Uber iPhone app used to book cars and private vehicles, to the modern taxation system and even the Roman Emperor Vespasian's urine tax. He never trivializes his subject matter or overwhelms his audience. We'll wait and see about that. But always conveys his love of antiquity and insists on its enduring impact on the modern world. It is the same enthusiasm and knowledge that he shares with his students at UQ, who benefit from an exceptional education in classical knowledge and will share with us all this evening. Please sit back and enjoy Professor Blanshard's inaugural Dr. Paul Eliadis Chair of Classics and Ancient History Professorial Lecture, Why the Ancient Greeks Matter. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, good evening, everyone. Like the previous speaker, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and their elders past and present. Vice-Chancellor, members of the University Senior Management Group, UQ colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, most especially Paul Eliadis, to whom we owe such a great debt. Indeed, I've often felt rather sorry for Paul because he was born a couple of thousand years too late. As I've often mentioned in the past, had he been born in the Hellenistic period, generosity such as his would have seen him awarded a dedication of a statue in the town square, seats at the theatre, public prayers for his good fortune, and after death he probably would have received cult, worshipped as a minor divinity for eternity. All we can offer you is a few canapes, and of course our profound and genuine gratitude for your tremendous gift. And it really is a gift worth celebrating. It allows the discipline to make a contribution both nationally and internationally, but also, and importantly, as the Vice-Chancellor has said, UQ has a particular burden when it comes to the traditional humanities in Queensland. Owing to the federated nature of Australia, students tend not to travel. And so, particularly the traditional humanities at UQ have a burden, which is that if we lose classics here, we lose it for a whole state and we lose it for generations. Without gifts like Paul's, we risk the situation that Queensland students will never hear the words of Aristotle, Plato, Aeschylus, or Herodotus. Certainly not in the original, and possibly not even in translation. So it's a precious legacy that Paul's gift ensures. So anyway, on to why does all this stuff matter? Well, when extraterrestrial life first encounters mankind, it's certainly going to be disappointed. If NASA's plans work out, aliens should arrive expecting a planet populated by creatures with the physiques of Greek statues. The fatter, older, softer, and more ethnically diverse reality of the world will come as a huge surprise. Certainly, that's the strong impression given by the plaques attached to Pioneer 10 and 11 spacecraft, that humanity only comes in one shape, and that shape is Greek. The Pioneer plaques, described as mankind's first serious attempt to communicate with extraterrestrial life, were designed by the American cosmologist Carl Sagan and his wife Linda. Composed of gold anodized aluminium, the plaques are designed to last in the vacuum of space for over 100 million years, making them mankind's most durable artifacts. When the Earth is no longer habitable, these plaques will remain as testament to how mankind saw itself. The plaques are divided into two sections. The radial lines on the left of the plaque represent the positions and periods of 14 pulsars with respect to our solar system. Using this information, alien civilizations should be able to pinpoint the time and location of the spacecraft's launch. The right-hand side represents the species that sent this probe into outer space. Now, the Sagans were explicit about the influence of Greek art in the drawings of mankind. The figures were drawn by Linda, and it's to Greek statuary that she turned for inspiration. The body shape and proportion are derived from Greek sculpture. Only in hairstyle did we make a concession to contemporary fashion. So it's actually Greek bodies with 70s hair that aliens will be expecting. The figures were depicted nude because that's what Greek art decreed. It also meant that the bodies were hairless. The conventions of Greek art decided the form that the nudity took. Now, the Sagans felt confident in turning to Greek art for the representation of ideal man because they were working in a long-established and venerated tradition. Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man was cited by them as an important precedent for their endeavour. This work of art has become canonical in our thinking about the human body. And once again, the influence of the classical world can be easily felt. The title of the work gives the clue. The work is called Vitruvian Man because it's an illustration of a section of Book 3 of the Roman writer Vitruvius's masterwork, De Architectura. And here we have imagining Vitruvius showing off his work to the Emperor Augustus. Now, this section of the book of De Architectura that Leonardo is illustrating is devoted to a discussion of the correct design of temples. The design of these buildings, Vitruvius says, should be governed by the principles of symmetry and proportion. And it's that description that, in fact, wraps round Leonardo's famous cartoon. The writing in the manuscript is his notes, and I've put some of them up, written, in fact, in his famous mirror writing on this text. But, of course, Vitruvius himself wasn't working in a vacuum. He was the heir to a specific set of ideal proportions of the human body that had come earlier from the Greeks, arguably from the famous canon of Polykleitos, here exemplified by Polykleitos' famous sculpture of the spear-bearer. So what we have here is an extraordinary sequence of events, whereby Greek sculpture gets picked up by a Roman writer, who then proves inspirational to a Renaissance artist, who then inspires a 70s cosmologist, who then sends out the image into outer space to become emblematic of man for alien civilizations, which are hopefully like this, but are probably more like this. What is important is that at each step, at each time, whether it's in the Roman period, the Renaissance, the 70s, or 100 million light years from now, when we have to think about what it means to be human, when we want to represent ourselves to our best ability, when we want to reduce ourselves to our essential essence, when we want to find some point of communication with the other, it's to the Greeks that we turn. The Greeks run through our cultural DNA. They set the parameters of what it means to be human. And that, in essence, would be one of the defining reasons why the Greeks matter. They are inexorably and intrinsically tied up with our notions of ourselves. Put simply, the Greeks matter because of their influence. Another way of arguing this case is to say that the Greeks matter because of their primacy. The Greeks matter because they did things first. And you don't need me to rehearse the tremendous catalogue of firsts that belong to the Greeks: philosophy, democracy, mathematics, science, along with the whole catalogue of literary genres that are bequeathed to us: drama, epic, bucolic, lyric, etc. So many firsts. I mean, Paul is very keen on the image of the Greeks writing the birth certificate for civilization, and in a sense, he's absolutely right. However, tonight, I want to think about another way of answering this question. Not focusing on their influence, not focusing on the things they did first. Instead, I want to argue that the Greeks matter not because of what they did first, but I want to argue they matter because of what they did best. In particular, in the rest of this lecture, I want to single out 3 elements that I think are exceptional about Greek civilization and hold important lessons for us today. And those 3 are the importance given to frank speech, the creation of a sense of community, and the inculcation of a sense of wonder. So let's begin with the first one, frank speech. At a key point in Plato's Republic, Plato turns to thinking about what constitutes the democratic city. And amongst others, he offers the following definition. The democratic city is the city that is overflowing with freedom and frank speech. Now, these days, we're very used, I think, to be thinking about that first limb. The political discourse of rights and freedoms is something that democratic theorists know and understand well. But it's that second element, frank speech, the slightly unusual addition, the bit that looks to me most Greek in this formulation, that I want to focus on. The word that Plato uses here for frank speech is the Greek word paresia, a word largely unknown before the birth of democracy, and indeed the institution and vocabulary seem to go together. It's a word particularly associated with the city of Athens. As Ion prays in the play named after him, "I wish that my mother was Athenian, so that I might inherit frank speech from her. For if you come from another race, you have a slavish mouth that is closed and lacks freedom." As you can see, paresia is a compound from pas, pan, meaning all, and resis, meaning speech or utterance. So literally, paresia is the saying of everything. Nothing is excluded. No idea too dangerous to entertain. And here I think it's important to indicate one of the key features of it, is that it's not freedom of speech, which is often how the term is translated. It includes that idea, but there's something more. It's edgy, surprising, disturbing, unconventional speech. Speech not varnished by rhetoric. It's a form of truth-telling. It's saying things that people don't want you to hear. Plato, by the way, was actually no fan of it. I should have pointed that out earlier when I quoted him. The ethos of frank speech makes itself manifest in a number of ways. It's what makes Greek political debate so fascinating and vibrant. And in fact, its absence, it seems to me, what makes contemporary political speech so dull. It's the cult of frank speech that allowed a politician like Demosthenes to stand up and make unpopular but necessary proposals. As he remarked in his Olympiacs, "I'm not talking just to pick a quarrel with you. Rather, I consider it my duty as a citizen to put matters of safety above issues of popularity." This was the principle that guided the orators of the past. I refer to the famous Aristides, to Nicias, to my own namesake, Demosthenes the General, and to Pericles. Paresia just doesn't create the space for Demosthenes to say unpopular things. It gives him the words, their weight, and their authority. But it's not just in the political arena that we see frank speech. Frank speech bleeds into every aspect of democratic culture. It informs the Greek politics and literature. One of the great pleasures I've had over the last semester has been running an upper-level undergraduate course on the history and literature of the Peloponnesian War, the great conflict that consumes the Greek world in the final third of the 5th century BC. Now, this was a war of unprecedented scale and brutality. It rewrote the nature of Greek conflict. Never had war lasted so long, never had so many died, never had the consequences been so great. This was the war that will see the end of the Athenian Empire. Yet what's striking for me is the bravery of the literature produced during this period. Athens doesn't retreat into soft, comfortable, patriotic rhetoric. Think in contrast about the dreadful war films our own culture produced during the Second World War. Films like Hitler, Beast of Berlin, Confessions of a Nazi Spy, or more subtle affair like The Way Ahead, or indeed my personal all-time favourite, In Which We Serve, in which evil Germans target plucky British transport ships, and in which the sailors in lifeboats die manfully against Noel Coward's chest, while he declares 3 cheers for the ship before being strafed by a Messerschmitt. So it's all kind of fabulous stuff. I do, by the way, love the shot on the top where they're having a break in the filming of the famous lifeboat scene so they can have a cup of tea, which is, it's so British, you wonder why it didn't make it into the film. Now, what's striking is that we can't find any parallel for this sort of nonsense in Athens during the time of the Peloponnesian War. That Athens, at the point in its history when it was most under pressure, when it was most threatened, most vulnerable, the fact that it eschewed the easy call of patriotic art seems to me remarkable. Indeed, Greek drama, especially tragedy, took this fragile city and turned up the screws. There was no sense that the duty of art was to toe the party line or be unquestionably patriotic. Moreover, this wasn't some fringe theatre. Athenian dramatists weren't Bloomsbury pacifists scribbling to each other in private letters. The great Dionysia, at which theatre was staged, was one of the largest state-sponsored festivals in the civic calendar. All citizens were invited to attend, and the city went out of its way to help ensure this. Athenian generals sat at the very front of the theatre. These days, it's become very popular to play down the radical and transgressive nature of tragedy, to see it as just another form of democratic ideology. And while it's a view that I have a certain degree of sympathy for in thinking about the framing of tragedy, it does seem to me to miss the central core, because at the heart of tragedy lies reversal. Tragedy delights in taking your comfortable assumptions and turning it on its head. Tragedy is the enemy of slogans. For example, you might think it perfectly acceptable to live your life by the line that you should help your friends and harm your enemies. Tragedy takes this maxim and shows you just what a world governed by it would look like. In Euripides' Trojan Women, we see Troy in the aftermath of Greek victory. The picture it paints of revenge and recrimination is a terrible one. Once noble women are parcelled out to cruel or indifferent masters, an innocent child is hurled from the battlements lest it grow up seeking revenge for its murdered father. A young girl is sacrificed on a tomb, her blood an offering to a now dead hero. Never has victory looked so inglorious. And it's worth noting that this play was performed in the aftermath of one of the most brutal Athenian massacres of the Peloponnesian War, when Athens slaughtered the citizens of the island of Melos. A number of members of the Athenian audience who attended Trojan Women would have left the theatre to go back home to be attended by million slave women, still mourning their murdered husbands, for whom the destruction of their city was still fresh and raw. And Trojan Women isn't the only example. We see this same sharp, critical knife applied again and again. Tragedy never lets you get comfortable. If you think all you need to do in life is just serve the state and obey your elders, then I offer you Sophocles' Philoctetes, where we see the older Odysseus corrupting the young Neoptolemus, and the pitiful plight of the abandoned, wounded Philoctetes, left by his comrades to rot on an island as they pursued greater glory at the walls of Troy. Likewise, if you thought piety was the way forward, tragedy has some surprises for you. Serving the gods proves a difficult task on the tragic stage. If you're too zealous in your devotion, you'll end up like Hippolytus, your body shattered and broken as the result of your father's curses. On the other hand, if you're too reticent to offer divine flattery, then the fate of Pentheus awaits you, your head ripped off by your mother's bare hands as she dances in an ecstatic trance. If you think it's okay to deny women a say in the running of the state, to disenfranchise them and keep them at home, think that they are powerless or lack the capacity to govern, well, tragedy has some lessons for you. Whether it's the heroine Antigone, who will stand toe-to-toe with the ruler of Thebes to give her brother the burial he deserves, or Electra, a woman prepared to take on the task of organising the revenge of her murdered father, or even Medea, who will remind you not only just what a woman is capable of and the revenge they will seek, but also the plight of all women that you exclude from office. Of all women, she says, that have breath and sensation, we women are the most unfortunate. At an exorbitant price, we must buy with a dowry a husband and masters of our body, and this husband determines our fortune. If our husbands live with us without resenting the marriage yoke, our life is enviable. Otherwise, death is preferable. A man, whenever he is annoyed with the company of those in the house, goes out. But we must fix our gaze on one person only. Men say that we live a life free from danger, at home while they fight with the spear. How wrong they are. I would rather stand 3 times with a shield in battle than give birth once. It's a powerful, moving, challenging text. It's easy to understand why it proved so popular with early 20th century suffragettes. The Actress's Franchise League used to begin every meeting by reciting Medea's speech to the women of Corinth, and Sylvia Pankhurst regarded it as one of her favourite works. As I said, the challenges that tragedy, a state-sponsored and promoted medium, posed to ideology is a story that could fill a whole lecture. But I want to move on to discuss the second of my Greek virtues. I'll deal with this much more briefly, mainly because it's in some ways allied to my point about frank speech. And that is the extraordinary sense of community that Greek society created. What is striking is that despite all this frank speech, a sense of community was managed to be maintained. Now, as a number of people know, I've long been interested in the nature of crime in the city, and why certain crimes, such as property theft, seem to be remarkably low. In comparison to other cultures, Athens, and indeed most Greek states, have a very underdeveloped legal system for dealing with theft. Even now, our understanding of Greek law and theft remains pretty sketchy. But in particular, one criminological feature has always amazed me. Why do we have no serial killers in the ancient world? Now, it's always been trotted out that Rome at its height was a city the size of Victorian London. So where, I've often asked, is Jack the Ripper? Now, part of the answer to this might be that there weren't any serial killers in the ancient world because largely there aren't many around today. That is to say that it's largely a phenomenon of media and our particular fears and anxieties. And on some level, that's got to be absolutely true. But I'm also interested in what explanatory discourses such as criminology and psychiatry might say about this, because their answer would be slightly different. If you start to look at the literature on the topic, there's a reasonably robust set of predictive factors for serial homicide, and I've put them on the slide. They are a sense of isolation from community and family, a lack of place and role in social hierarchy, and the absence of figures able to mitigate social humiliations. And indeed, if anyone's looking for some bedtime reading, I can recommend Malloy, Offender and Offence Characteristics of a Non-Random Sample of Adolescent Mass Murderers as a particularly joyous thing to do. Now, what these points all kind of point to is the idea of isolation and loneliness. And what I think is striking about the ancient world, and particularly the ancient polis, is that it's impossible ever to be lonely. We do have a concept of solitude, but loneliness is something else. In the ancient city, you're always surrounded by friends, family, or slaves. Your social status is fixed in a way that isn't the case now. You weren't burdened with having to make decisions or handle problems on your own. In fact, trying to find moments when someone exercises independent judgment in the city is practically impossible. Every decision from marriage to sale of property to how you'd vote in the assembly was done in concert with others. Trying to find lonely people in Athens is hard. I've tried. And this seems to me to be the point of Menander's play The Discalus, which begins with a grumpy old man who just wants to be left alone. And I've given you his opening lines on the slide, where he wishes he could have wings so that he could avoid people, and Medusa's head so he could turn them to stone if they came too close. Now, the whole point of this play is to show the impossibility and undesirability of Cnemon ever getting his dream. Indeed, through the actions of the god Pan and a cunning slave, he's eventually reconciled to his community, and the play ends in an elaborate wedding feast with Cnemon forced to join in the drinking and singing with others. Even kind of misanthropes like Diogenes of Sinope thrived on human contact. Diogenes, the founder of the philosophic movement known as Cynicism, was infamous for his antisocial activities. Many stories are told about his life. He supposedly lived in a giant storage jar in the central marketplace of Athens. Unshaven and unwashed, he rolled his jar onto the hot sands in summer so that he sweltered, and in winter he wandered the streets barely clothed and embraced snow-covered statues so that he could experience the pain of bitter cold. No person, no matter what their status, was exempt from his abuse. He berated Alexander the Great for standing around and blocking out the sun when he came to visit him. In an insulting lesson to the prince, he pretended to be unable to distinguish the bones of Alexander's father, Philip, from the bones of a common slave, thereby teaching him a lesson about the equality that we all experience in death. Yet the important point about so many of the stories about Diogenes is that they require an audience. Paradoxically, it's very hard to be misanthropic by yourself. It takes two to be grouchy. There seems to be no better illustration of this than the famous story of Diogenes wandering the city with a lamp during daylight hours, pompously declaring to anyone who asked that he was looking unsuccessfully for an honest man. Now, this act only works if someone actually stops Diogenes to ask, "Why are you wandering the streets with a lamp while the sun is shining?" If no one stops to talk to Diogenes, then the joke doesn't have a punchline. And so, a sense of the community, even the kind of misanthropes are kind of bound into a kind of great sense of community. And that brings me to my final and third virtue, which is a sense of wonder. From the very beginning, the Greeks had a strong sense of the marvelous. Arguably, it was this sense that led to the creation of the discipline of history. The openings of Herodotus' Histories, the first work of history in the Western tradition, capture this feeling. Herodotus of Halicarnassus here displays his inquiry, his historia, so that human achievements may not be forgotten in time, and great and marvellous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some by barbarians, a point I'm going to come back to, may not be without their glory. History, then, is a catalogue of great things. This catalogue of marvels is a project that starts with Herodotus, but continues long after him, all the way through to the Hellenistic period. The most famous catalogue of marvels is, of course, the list compiled at some point in the Hellenistic period that we know of as the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And for those of you who are into pub trivia, you can now test to see whether you can remember the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which are the statue of Zeus by Phidias, the lighthouse of Alexandria, the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the pyramids of Egypt, the hanging gardens of Babylon, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, how many got that? And the Colossus of Rhodes. Now, it's worth noting about this list that the wonders are not exclusively Greek. Note the inclusion of the pyramids of Egypt and the hanging gardens of Babylon. Now, as anyone who's been to Egypt will tell you, it would be hard to draw up a list of ancient wonders and not include the pyramids. However, the hanging gardens are a very different matter. And the main reason why the hanging gardens, the inclusion of the hanging gardens is so odd, is that no Greek ever saw the hanging gardens of Babylon. By the time the list was drawn up, they'd long gone. Indeed, it seems highly unlikely that the hanging gardens of Babylon ever existed. They're a myth. We can't find any archaeological evidence for their existence in Babylon. The stories about them are terribly inconsistent and just don't make sense. What seems to have happened, in fact, is that stories about fabulous gardens in Nineveh, not Babylon, so in fact we should probably be talking about the hanging gardens of Nineveh. If you want to be pedantic, you can impress your friends with that, have been over time kind of embroidered and elaborated and then get translated to Babylon. So the fact that we have an invented wonder by a foreign power on our list seems to me important. It speaks of a deliberate desire to include non-Greek works into the list, a belief that wonder exists beyond and is not owned by any particular ethnicity and nationality. These days, it's become very fashionable to deride the ancient Greeks for their xenophobia and ethnic stereotyping. Works such as Edith Hall's Inventing the Barbarian, Benjamin Isaac's The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity, and Francois Hartog's The Mirror of Herodotus, the representation of the other in the writing of history, have been very good at bringing to our attention the ways in which the Greeks could be exclusionary and xenophobic. But it's worth stressing that these features are at their most extreme during the period of the Athenian Empire, an empire whose claim to authority rested on resisting the Persians. it seems to me that there's another stream, equally strong, that runs through Greek culture. And that theme is a theme of curiosity and a desire to engage with the other. We see it in the early pre-Socratics. Take, for example, Xenophanes, who observes that the nature of God varies from culture to culture, and that the nature of divinity is embedded in that culture. For those of you who are ticking this off, I've now done philosophy, history, I'm now doing studies of religion, so I will have worked my way through every element on that banner in front of you. Here's Xenophanes. The Ethiopians make their gods dark and snub-nosed, while the Thracians make them blue-eyed and red-haired. I'm particularly fond of these Thracian red-haired gods. Now, it's this observation which allows him to make his more radical conjecture that God is only relative and that our understanding of gods might be flawed. As he observed, if horses and cows could make images of gods, they'd produce gods that looked like horses and cows. Now, you can only make such radical thought experiments, and they can only be persuasive if you start from the position that the Ethiopians and Thracians are not wrong or inferior or deluded, but rather they have something important and interesting to say. So we see then at the very beginning of Greek thought this curiosity and this interest in the others. And it seems to me that it comes to prominence, indeed it's a necessary precursor for, the tremendous flowering of Greek culture in the Hellenistic period, where we see the rise of extraordinary hybrid cultures that combine elements of Greek, Egyptian, Syrian, and Indian cultures. Whether it's Greco-Buddhist Gandharan art, where we see the legacy of the Greek communities that were founded in modern-day Pakistan. I particularly love this image here of Hercules and Buddha together. I often wonder what they would talk about. Or the multifaceted nature of Ptolemaic propaganda, a regime that seems equally at home in multiple modes of representation, as we can see from these two portraits of Ptolemy Philadelphus, one as pharaoh, one in Greek guise. Time and again, we see these kind of engagements of a profound nature. So, in conclusion, individually, each of these elements, frank speech, a feeling of community, and a sense of the marvelous that transcends any individual culture, are admirable virtues. But together, they create a special kind of discursive space, a conversational society which always leaves the door open for the miraculous, a place where quite radical politics can occur. And this, I suggest, is part of the reason why free thinkers, whether it's Erasmus and the Renaissance humanists, whether it's Diderot, Voltaire and the philosophe, whether it's Nietzsche, Marx, Freud and Jung, that it's to the Greeks that they keep turning. It's the Greeks that they argue with. It's the Greeks that they appropriate. And it's the Greeks they sometimes misrepresent. It's a mistake to imagine the classical tradition is a conservative or comfortable one. In fact, it's the opposite. It's quite a radical place. In a lecture in 1983 in Berkeley, the philosopher Michel Foucault took as his topic the Greek word that I began this lecture with, parousia. For him, frank speech was one of the central concerns of Greek philosophy. The Greeks, he suggested, posed certain questions for themselves and for us. Who is able to tell the truth? What are the moral, the ethical, and the spiritual conditions which entitle someone to present himself as a truth teller? About what topics is it important to tell the truth? About the world, about nature, about the city, about behaviour, about man? What are the consequences of telling the truth? And finally, what is the relation between the activity of truth-telling and the exercise of power? Foucault's Greeks pose the central questions that should be at the core of any university. It's because the Greeks create the preconditions for precisely this sort of exploration that, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest to you, the Greeks matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alastair. I think that's an extraordinary lecture, revealing an extraordinary ability to be funny, articulate, insightful, thought-provoking and convincing all at the same time. And we only gave you 30 minutes, so I might start coming to your 2-hour lectures myself. Alastair has 10 or 15 minutes, or we have 10 or 15 minutes in which Alastair can take questions or comments from the audience.
Yes.
We had a member of the security establishment expose the secrets of the NSA, Edward Snowden. And I just wonder if you could comment on how revealing the truth in this instance reflects what you just talked about.
Yes, yeah. For me, what is striking about Athens is that commitment to the frankness of speech, with a sense that they have complete confidence that democracy is robust enough that it can deal with truth. And indeed, as in fact the extraordinary success of Athenian democracy showed over a century, in a world where the actual principles of democracy were radical experiments, right? To claim that every person has the capacity to govern in a world of monarchy, in a world of oligarchy, is an extraordinary claim to make. And it seems to me it's an absolute belief that democracy is robust enough to handle the truth that I think is the sort of the defining feature. And if I had to kind of put one point, I think it really is that we could learn from the Greeks.
It's the 2000th anniversary of the death of Augustus Caesar, and the Romans took so much Greek literature and art, and yet when he was looking around for some system of government, he failed to come across democracy. And that autocracy went almost 2,000 years to get to democracy. Why did the Romans take on some of his ideas of democracy? They seem to have lost it completely.
Yeah. Well, look, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I mean, it's always striking that, for example, both in the American and French revolutions, they're founded as republics. They're deliberately not founded as democracies. They become democracies, but actually the model that they're aiming for is the republic. And partly what I think is influencing them there is a theory that the republic combines the best forms of government. It combines aspects of monarchy, it combines aspects of oligarchy, and it combines, importantly, aspects of democracy. And I think that is an appealing recipe, particularly for a world in which the legacy of the king is still present. That although you might overthrow the monarch, the idea of trying to think outside the monarch it is still a very kind of new idea, and so I think that's partly why you don't find the democratic principle in the later republics. In the, Augustus is. I'm glad Augustus is dead. I think that should be good. Never has such a Alexander the Great also. Never has such a brigand and foul person got such an amazing reputation. And I think Augustus is a deeply problematic figure. So yes, I think leave it at that. Yes, that.
Your description of parousia seems to fit what is today normally put forward by satire. And I was just thinking, when it comes to a lot of the criticism of the current government, of the ABC and shows such as The Chaser and other satirical programs, what are your thoughts about parousia as satire in today's world?
Yeah, the problem with satire is that it largely exists within a bubble. That it's hard to see where satire gets its political purchase. So that part of the game of satire is that you can walk away. And in a sense, that's why I kind of wanted to focus on tragedy rather than, for example, comedy, when I was talking about Athens. Because, you know, comedy has, again, a kind of very strong anti-war agenda. But at the same time, if you look at Greek comedy, it attacks war, but it proposes fantastic solutions, right? So we should build cities in the sky, we should go down into the underworld to get poets, we should let women run the state. I mean, so all the kind of things about that Athenian comedy offers, right, are designed to be kind of farcical, whereas tragedy doesn't allow you to escape it. I think that's, for me, the important thing. And I think that's the same both with kind of satire, both Roman satire, right, which is largely about adoption of a persona and a kind of engagement with a persona, that I think distinguishes it from the kind of frank speech, which I think is impossible to ignore. I think that's the kind of crucial bit about why I think it's different from satire. But clearly, the two are interlinked. Well, look, I'm a fan of political correctness, so it's kind of but at the same time, it seems to me that I don't think that necessarily it's about a concern about frank speech. I mean, it seems to me that what often goes under the banner of actual political correctness is in fact an issue about concern for the feelings of others. And it seems to me that actually is part of what my second point was, which was about how you combine frank speech with a sense of community. And it seems to me that it's those two that go together that make the Greek experiment so interesting. And so for me, I think that's where I kind of see, I can see the problem. That said, however, I'm totally happy with the franker speech, the better.
I hate to raise small points, but excellent talk, and I hate to raise small points, but it's not particularly small. But what you were saying about Parrhesia and Demosthenes, you're quite right. But there is, on more than one occasion, Demosthenes himself says that it's not possible to speak freely in your assembly, men of Athens, on all things. So there were limits to this. And also the matter of Parrhesia in the Republic, where Socrates is saying that in Athens it exists, it's there. But with Socrates, this is one of the gravest criticisms of democracy. The fact that in democracy, as Socrates says, everybody does exactly as they want and there is no rule of law and order. And he puts democracy only one step ahead of tyranny, the worst, vilest form of government. Would you like to comment?
Yes,
you don't have to.
Yes, look, I would love to comment. I think a couple of things that need to be said. I mean, one, that is to say that the phenomenon of societies not living up to their ideals is not unknown. But that doesn't mean that the ideals of that society aren't themselves admirable. And I think, that when you look at the robustness of Athenian political debate, it is a very different kind of debate. In terms of looking at, in terms of looking at how, the trial of Socrates, for example, would be a good point about what happens to the gadfly who is too frank in his speech. But I think, the historical circumstances of that particular moment after the reign of the 30 provide some level of excuse. I mean, the other thing just to say is that, the fact that philosophers don't like democracy isn't a surprise, right? I mean, philosophers in antiquity, I'd like to point this out, philosophers in antiquity are no friends of democracy, and indeed, offer all sorts of kind of critiques of it. So, the philosophic opposition to democracy is well known. If you, as they would argue, the best form of government is philosopher kings. Well, that seems to me a recipe for disaster. But we'll see.
So Thank you very much, Alastair, and I just invite everyone to join me in once again thanking Alastair Blanshard. For thanking Professor Alastair Blanshard for a quite stunning inaugural professorial lecture. And I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'd like to invite you to join us upstairs on the terrace for drinks and nibbles. Thank you.
Very good. Very enjoyable. Oh, thank you for coming.